Hi, I'm Steve Clemons, and I have a question. Can Trump's new plan end Israel's war on Gaza? Let's get to the bottom line. U.S. President Donald Trump has made a new take-it-or-leave-it offer to Hamas, calling for an end to Israel's onslaught in Gaza that's now killed or maimed more than 235,000 Palestinians over the past 2 years. This 20-point plan drops Trump's earlier position on ethnically cleansing the Gaza Strip from its citizens and creates a new government for Gaza that would be chaired by Donald Trump himself, along with former UK Prime Minister Tony Blair. But in Gaza, just as in Ukraine, how much is Trump's unpredictability part of the problem? Does his penchant for dramatic gestures and U-turns and disdain for details and zero patience to actually get to the bottom of serious issues ever work? And is the U.S., despite all its power and its threats and its promises, creating a leaderless world where regional powers are going to do as they see fit and innocent people become collateral damage, only to create a bigger mess down the road? Today, we're talking with one of America's leading geopolitical thinkers, Stephen Walt, professor of international relations at Harvard University. Stephen, thank you so much for joining us. Look, we now have a 20-point plan that's sort of been revealed in very awkward ways with a lot of extra pieces that are still evolving. This is, of course, about a potential deal on Israel and Gaza negotiated by Qatar, the United States, and other players to bring this now 2-year-long conflict to some sort of end. What do you think about this plan? What does it say about the United States and Israel at this moment?
Well, I don't think it's, in fact, a serious peace plan. I think ultimately it's not going to accomplish the stated purpose of ending the horrible conflict in Gaza. It's, I think, ultimately also going to be seen as yet another case where the United States kind of half-heartedly and one-sidedly intervened in an ongoing Middle East conflict and ended up being unable to deliver it. I think, again, this was designed primarily by people who were very staunchly pro-Israel. It's supervised by them, it's administered by them, and it asks Hamas to give essentially everything that Netanyahu wants up front in exchange for some rather vague promises that they might get some of the things they would want, or that the Palestinians would want at some point down the road. So I think ultimately this is not a serious plan.
Some have said this is good because it'll stop the killing on the ground. It will plus up aid to Palestinians that is badly, badly needed right now. That it will begin to kind of create a transition authority and a withdrawal plan. So what are the key parts of that story where you find yourself in opposition to Arab leaders that are endorsing this?
Well, again, one doesn't know exactly how deep or sincere the Arab endorsement is, and particularly with regard to your point about, what exactly does this plan state? The fact that there's more than one version of it is, at a minimum, worrisome. The other part, of course, is that Hamas was not involved in all of this, and Hamas is still a critical player here. This doesn't end if Hamas rejects it. It also doesn't end if Hamas says, we'd like to use this as a basis for negotiation, but we're not going to agree to this full stop. It also doesn't end if Hamas does agree to it, and then at some point down the road, the Netanyahu government says, well, Hamas really isn't fulfilling all of the terms they agreed to, so we're going to resume the war or continue the war. The problem here, again, is there are a whole series of rather challenging and difficult conditions that have to be met, complicated processes that are going to have to be implemented. Ideally, fair-minded people deciding who's living up to their commitments and who isn't. It's not clear that we have such fair-minded people in place here. So again, there are probably more questions about this so-called peace plan than there are answers. And finally, the plan ends with this very vague commitment to a possible credible pathway toward a Palestinian state. This is where a serious plan would begin, not where it would end. It would begin with a clear commitment to that. And we have seen this movie many times, beginning with the Oslo process, beginning with the Bush administration's roadmap, beginning with the so-called Middle East Quartet. I think of this as sort of Lucy, Charlie Brown, and the football. Palestinians have been told repeatedly that someday there will be a pathway to statehood. And this plan says that's at the very end of the rainbow, not something really to take seriously.
Let's listen to President Trump for a moment, who has words for Hamas about this deal.
If Hamas rejects the deal, which is always possible, they're the only one left. Everyone else has accepted it. But I have a feeling that we're going to have a positive answer. But if not, as you know, Bibi, you'd have our full backing to do what you would have to do.
So it's ominous in a way, Steve, because you heard the president say, if they don't accept this full board, they don't accept this, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, have at it, keep going, which we've seen what that picture looks like. So I'm just interested in whether or not you and I are going to be talking about this story a year from now on the 3rd anniversary of October 7th.
Unfortunately, I think that's as likely as that there will be a serious cessation of hostility and relief for the humanitarian disaster that this has been. Again, what President Trump says there is essentially a green light to Benjamin Netanyahu to continue the war if he, Benjamin Netanyahu, decides that the circumstances warrant it. So that, I don't think, solves the problem. Remember that Israel's been trying to eradicate Hamas for 2 years and has yet to succeed. And so convincing Hamas now to suddenly surrender, to completely disarm, trusting to Israeli goodwill, it seems to me, is to ask a great deal. And the president has said that the United States will continue to back the Israeli government no matter what it does, not something that's likely to reassure Hamas that they're actually going to achieve the kind of peace that they want, or that regular, ordinary Palestinians who are not part of Hamas are going to finally get an end to the nightmare that they've experienced over the past 2 years.
I'm interested in what Tony Blair and the president's son-in-law, Donald Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, did, and how you think about the mechanics of this particular peace deal.
Well, again, this was a peace deal negotiated by people who I don't think are entirely objective in which side they favor here. And it's worth remembering that Jared Kushner's famous Abraham Accords that were supposed to, reconcile Israel with the rest of the Arab world and usher in a new era in the Middle East, of course, completely excluded the Palestinians as a serious part of it. And it was one of the things, not intentionally, but it was one of the things that, of course, led Hamas to launch the murderous attacks back on October 7th, 2023. So what was intended to be this great peace initiative, of course, unwittingly triggered the conflict that we are in today. I don't think Jared Kushner is the guy you want necessarily designing a peace plan that's going to actually bring peace.
One of the other interesting things was to see President Trump's statement by executive order giving Qatar, which had been bombed, and got Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu to call him from the White House and to apologize to the Emir of Qatar for bombing their territory, which was, a unique element of theater that I have never seen and something I didn't expect. But I just want to read here that we have a statement, an executive order by the president. Says the U.S. regard any attack on Qatar's territory, sovereignty, or critical infrastructure as a threat to the peace and security of the United States itself. It's basically an Article 5, NATO-like, commitment. Shocked a lot of folks. It was in the actual 20-point plan. It used to be 21 points. But I'm interested in that, not only in what you think it achieves or doesn't achieve. What does it say about America in the world right now that kind of deal would be at least issued by executive order?
There's several points to make about it. I mean, first of all, Qatar is the host to a major American military base. And if there was a serious threat to Qatari independence or to the security of the American facilities there, the United States would come to Qatar's aid, regardless of whether or not there was an executive order from the president or not. It's a sufficient strategic interest that we would be likely to respond in that situation. Second, I think this was really, something of a sop to the Qataris, who were clearly deeply upset by what happened, an attempt to reassure others in the region that the United States would still help protect them, and also something of a gentle warning sign to the Israelis not to do something like this again, that this was really a rash act on the Israelis' part. They shouldn't have done it, that the Trump administration is annoyed by it, and so it's, in a sense, a warning to them. The third thing I'd say is that Donald Trump does not have a terrific track record at keeping promises. So I think the Qataris and others in the region aren't going to place excessive weight on this executive order, even though it has lots of language that sounds sort of NATO-like. It sounds as good or better than some of the commitments we've made to treaty allies in other parts of the world. And I think one of the things you're seeing, and this is, I think, is the main thrust of your question, is already countries in the region are starting to look for other arrangements, whether it's the Saudis engaging in a détente with Iran, Saudis looking to some degree to China for closer relations, and the recent defense pact that Saudi Arabia signed with Pakistan as well. All of these are indications that confidence in American protection is down, and the executive order is not likely to change that very much.
So I happen to be a fan and a regular reader of Stephen Walt articles, and I just want to read a line from an article that you recently published, and I believe in Foreign Policy, so can read it, called "Donald Trump Will Never Be a Restrainer." You write here something that's, you don't mince words. You write, Trump and his minions are the poster children for poorly prepared, incompetently staffed, inconsistently pursued, and ultimately unsuccessful diplomatic engagements. Trump and Secretary of State, National Security Advisor Marco Rubio have gutted the State Department, discarded the normal interagency process, and turned critical negotiations on Gaza and Ukraine over to a real estate lawyer with no obvious qualifications and some potential conflicts of interest. Is it any wonder that they have achieved so little? What do you really think, Professor Walt?
Well, I think I summarized that pretty clearly what I thought, and it's consistent with what I was saying earlier about Gaza. I mean, the other point I would make in that article, you sometimes hear it said that Trump is really an isolationist, that he's a restrainer, someone who believes the United States should be relying primarily upon diplomacy and military force as a last resort, that military force should be used to defend American vital interests, but not to engage in, say, regime change or social engineering around the world, that American allies should bear a greater responsibility for their own defense, but the United States should, in a number of circumstances, be willing to commit to their defense. So restrainers are not isolationists. It's often argued that Trump is, a secret restrainer, but I think if you look at what he's done so far, the United States is still deployed all over the world. We are about to have $1 trillion defense budget. We're extending an economic lifeline to Argentina, the security guarantee to Qatar that we just talked about. We bombed Iran a couple of months ago as well. So this is not either a restrained or an isolationist United States, at least not yet.
I'm just interested in whether or not, if Donald Trump is not who people thought he was, and we begin to see that he's like every other president that is largely kind of fueling this, ever-growing set of commitments, military capacity, kind of hijacked for various moments, don't you think that's going to have an interesting political impact inside the United States?
Well, so the one thing Trump has been different in is he's not interested in American ground troops being committed in any place where they're likely to have to stay and where we're likely to suffer serious casualties. He likes to use air power, and he likes to use it in short bursts, and going after targets that can't really hit back in a significant way, like, alleged drug smugglers in the Caribbean. And that is something of a departure from some of his predecessors, not all of them, but some of them. But he's not willing, I think, to reduce America's overall security commitments, certainly not reducing defense spending, still remaining engaged in a variety of different places. And remember something important here. A truly isolationist, a truly restrained United States is not one that Trump could use to extort concessions from other countries. Right? One of the reasons he's been able to bully a number of other countries on economic deals and other things is they want to retain American protection. They want the United States to still be there. If he were truly to disengage from many of those commitments, those countries would have far less reason to accommodate the United States on other matters and far less reason to invest money in Trump hotels. So I think there's going to be real limits to how restrained his foreign policy becomes.
It seems to me that order, kind of fashioned after World War II, is coming undone America is kicking down its own hill that it was the king of, and that we're untethering ourselves as Americans from the very system that we created to promulgate and extend our power. So I'm just interested, as you kind of look at many of the things you've written, what are the implications down the road for the world, for conflict, for order?
I think it's likely to be a more disorderly world. I mean, we shouldn't be nostalgic about the so-called unipolar era, the post-Cold War period where the United States was really the only great power. That was not a perfect world, and American leadership and ability to manage events, I think, was always somewhat exaggerated. But we are, I think, moving into a world where we now are going to have a multipolar world, lopsided one, with the United States and China in the lead, Russia, perhaps India, perhaps the European Union, trailing far behind. And those different planets, if you want to call it that, are going to compete to some degree, jockey for position in various ways. The two largest ones, the United States and China, will not align. They will remain opposed to each other. They may cooperate to manage that cooperation, try to prevent a major clash. And then the rest of the world will operate within that. I believe you'll see a world where there's still a sphere around the United States, perhaps a smaller sphere than we have seen in the past, and a sphere orbiting around China. And in that world, when you think about it, the country, the superpower that does the best job of accommodating its allies, being attractive to them, not taking advantage, not exploiting them excessively, is the one that's going to be more appealing. So if you have a highly predatory superpower, it's going to find it harder to make friends, find itself repelling others, and finding, perhaps in the American case, some of its former allies looking elsewhere. That is, I think, a less stable world than the one we've had before. And then if you add in all the other destabilizing factors, whether it's technology, climate change, increased protectionism, et cetera, I think we are looking at a bleaker future than we might have had otherwise.
I'm just wondering, is something like the 20-point plan that we're seeing between Gaza, is this sort of, a benchmark that could be like the Suez Crisis, where no matter what you think you're earnestly possibly achieving, it actually becomes a punctuation point where no one believes in the credibility of American action, and it could become like the Suez, where everybody begins shifting and said, the U.S. is done now, we have to look towards Beijing, or we have to look to Delhi.
It's like the old Hemingway line, how did I go bankrupt gradually, then suddenly? There can be these tipping points where suddenly people around the world make a fundamental recalculation. The other quotation that's relevant here is Napoleon, never interrupt your opponent when they are making a mistake. And I think that's how, say, China now views the Trump administration, the systematic weakening of American commitments, the undermining of science and technology here in the United States. This is a glorious gift from the Chinese point of view. The United States still very powerful, has many assets, many strengths. So the rest of the world is not going to abandon us immediately. But there are, I think, significant doubts being raised about American judgment, what the trajectory of American power ultimately will be. If the American military is now focused more on fictitious internal enemies than at potential foreign conflicts, that's an opportunity for others as well. So I do worry about a moment not where everyone abandons the United States, but where enough significant countries begin to distance themselves and make other arrangements that the United States loses many of the advantages we've had diplomatically around the world for many, many decades.
So are there any blind spots in this, in the sense that as you see a more chaotic world and whatnot, the great powers that, the Middle East, some would argue, has never really mattered except for oil, in the eyes of many Western. Does the Middle East have a chance to actually leapfrog into different circumstances while the world is in disarray?
No question. I mean, first of all, they are going to have more options diplomatically and militarily. Since 1990, the United States has been kind of the only game in town in terms of major powers, with Russia playing a minor role for countries like Syria. But now we're, I think, seeing a world where different Middle East countries can reach out in lots of different directions and do so beneficially. Also, they have themselves been trying to diversify out of single reliance on oil and gas as their principal source of revenue. I think that is likely to work out well for at least some of them. So they're going to have more freedom of action in a post-unipolar world. And as I was saying earlier, you're already seeing signs of that geopolitically in terms of some of the connections that these countries are making around the world.
I'm just interested in how Israel, as it is organized politically right now, is looking at its future. And if it sees some of the things we're seeing, where American power is dissipating, where you see less leverage, you see more chaotic world in the future, is Israel, in terms of its long-term circumstances, undermining its own future?
I think that's the case, and I think many Israelis are deeply worried about this for understandable reasons. I mean, first of all, the country is internally divided, not on every issue, but internally divided between sort of left and right. And the right has become more politically powerful and more extreme over time, and that trend is not likely to change. Israel's increasingly seen as a threat by other countries in the region, including countries that it was improving relationships with until Gaza, the genocide, and the recent military actions. It's worth remembering that Israel has not just been acting in Gaza. They attacked in Lebanon, they attacked in Syria, they've attacked Iran as well. They've attacked the Houthis in Yemen. Not surprisingly, others in the region now worry about what Israel is likely to do. They are increasingly isolated internationally, and you see in particular countries in Europe beginning to be much more critical, suggesting various forms of pressure. And finally, their popularity in the United States is declining, certainly among younger people, certainly within the Democratic Party. Support for Israel used to be a bipartisan consensus, and public opinion polls were very positive. Those have all shifted in the other direction as a result of what's happened in Gaza. And that, if you were Israeli and you're worried about your long-term future, has got to be a deep, deep concern. As you add all that together, if I think Israel continues on its present course, it's in for a very troubling and very difficult future.
Well, Stephen Walt, this is our 6th anniversary show. We're very grateful that you come on and share your thoughts. You know, one of the things I love about your work is you're a communicator. You take complex ideas and you talk to people about them, you write about them, you blog about them, and you come talk to folks on the bottom line. So thank you so much for joining us. Stephen Walt, Professor of International Relations at Harvard University. Always appreciate your candor.
All right. Congratulations on your 6th anniversary, Steve. Pleasure talking with you.
So what's the bottom line? Even today, after all the changes in the world brought about by the 7th of October 2023 and its aftermath, there are literal fights between UN aid providers and Israeli forces about getting people starving in Gaza some high-protein peanut butter. I can't believe I just said that. I never believed I would make such a sentence. Even peanut butter has been weaponized. But it would be a mistake to look at this conflict as just a function of Hamas or of Israel and its rage and its own territorial ambitions. This moment is a reflection of how U.S. leaders look at the rest of the world. They might think that they're projecting American power and American strength in the U.S. brand, but what people are seeing is the exact opposite, the erosion of power and diminishing belief in America as an idea. What is sad but has to be acknowledged is that the Palestinian people have been turned into collateral damage, victims, a function of relations between other big powers with no agency of their own. Real breakthroughs are going to happen only when U.S. leaders understand that one quick 20-point plan, erratically conceived with multiple conflicting versions, is sure to only perpetuate this conflict. And that's the bottom line.